Good morning. Today we're going to be looking at how we can use a 2D array object in Java using the MVC framework. As we take a look over here on the left-hand side in my 2D project of Joy, as you can see, I have my grid.controller package, my grid.model package, my grid.view, and my grid.test package. And so we're going to take a look at all these as we actually go through this. Our grid.runner, our grid runner file is going to be the standard one, just simply a public side void main. Don't really have to worry about that. We're going to, of course, start off with our grid controller. As you can see right here, we have that file open up right now. We have the imports that go along with that. You can check that out by figuring out as we go through what we're doing on this. But as you can see, we have the idea of a grid controller. It has a couple data members, a grid frame called appFrame, which is our GUI component, as well as a 2D array of our curry object, which is what I'm making to actually deal with this. We then have our constructor, and we want to, as you can see, we have a note right here saying we want to make sure that we create our model objects here before we create the GUI. This is so that when we actually build and run the object, we can actually see the information for it. As you can see, I declare and instantiate my grid as a new array of 2D of curry objects by 6 by 5, and then I call my fillGrid method. We can see that private helper method right below where it's going to go through and instantiate for every cell within that 2D grid. A new curry object will be instantiated to that. Then we then create our appFrame object by creating the new GridFrame, passing a reference to this for the controller object. We also have our start method that gives us information to, as a pop-up message, which is tied directly to the appFrame itself with a quick little starting message. I have a getter for both my frame and my grid. And then I have inside here, I have a couple different little helper methods we'll be seeing as we go and look at the actual information as we pass through that. And we'll go ahead and switch over to that. Let's take a look at the curry object in the model package. As you can see, our curry object is really quite basic. When I made this curry object at the beginning, I actually just did a quick diagram of that. And we take a look at that curry diagram. We have a quick little diagram of our curry object right here. As you can see, we did a UML diagram just to show what's in. It is inside the grid.model package. It's of type curry. We have a single data member called spice level. It's of type int. And we have three methods. We have the curry constructor, which is not quite a method. We have the toString method, and we have a set spice level, so we can actually assign a specific level of spice for this curry object. Now, we could, of course, go much more fancy and create all of the sorts of things that go along with this, but what we're doing today is just giving the idea of how we can actually create a 2D array of a specific object and see how we can actually interact with that using Java. Switching back over to Eclipse, and we see the code that goes along with it. As you can see, really basic code for the object. We just initialize our data member. Our setter just like every other setter that we've had throughout our code. And our toString method just gives a quick little string value about the actual object, just like a toString method should. So once we've got that, let's go ahead and take a look at the frame that goes along with this. We take a look at GridFrame right here. And as you can see, our GridFrame class extends JFrame. We're doing a customized frame like we always do for our code. We have a reference to the base controller. It's passed as a parameter to the constructor, which gets assigned to this data member right here. We also have a data member of panel for a type GridPanel, which is a reference for the GUI panel we'll be using. And just like normal, we assign the base controller reference into the data member. We create a new GridPanel, passing it that same reference to the base controller. We call our helper method for setupFrame, where we initialize the panel itself as a set content pane. We say how big we want to have the screen exist, and we give it a quick little title so we can have some information passing to our tests. And as always, our last line of code is setupFrame. We set visible to true. And for testing purposes, to make sure we properly initialize our data members, we have a little helper method to get the base controller. Just a standard getter, looks just like normal for that. Now, where the action happens most of the time is going to be inside the grid panel. This is where the user is going to see everything happen. And as you can see right here, inside our grid panel, we have a variety of data members that belong to this. We have a few JText fields, an image icon, a couple JLabels, a JButton, a spring layout, a grid controller reference, and then, especially for the 2D project, we have our grid table and our grid pane. Now, our standard set of our constructor is the standard job of initialization of all our basic data types right there. And as you can see, we've got most of those initialized with some really quite stable, standard little bits of code. We do want to take a look at the image right here. As you can see, I'm creating a new image icon using the getClass, getResource method, which takes a string as a parameter, and it tells me where to find the actual image. And as I've been using all year, I put inside an images folder inside my view package so I can have access to it just basically where it would be found. And then I'm having it making a blank label attached to the actual image and having it set for center. Just so I don't need to show any text on it, it's just there. Notice though that I did not initialize my grid table or my grid pane in here. Rather, I have a special setup method just for that, a nice helper method called setupTable. We scroll down right here and we take a look at this. We'll go ahead and minimize the screen so we can get more code on that. As you can see right here inside the setupTable helper method, once we've maximized the screen a bit more, we're going to say that we're going to do a couple things so we can actually extend that MVC relationship to our table itself. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a DefaultTableModel object. The DefaultTableModel is a way of linking model data to a view component inside the actual GUI itself. In this case, we create a default table model, And when we do that, we pass it a reference to the 2D array of information. In this case, it's a 2D grid, it's a 2D array of objects. We do that by using the baseController.getGrid method. That returns a 2D array of query objects, as you can see right here. So all the queries are stored in there. The second parameter of that default table model is a single string array that allows it for a single string array that allows for the titles of the columns. Very helpful when we're actually going to do this. And so I just get a column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going through that structure because it's a 5-column structure as we saw earlier. I then say GridTable is a new JTable, and then I do GridTable.setModel, and I pass it this data model that we just created right here on line 53, and I pass it as the model for the table. So I'm linking the model data to the table that's going to use it. And then where it gets even more amazing is I'm going to say that GridPane is a new scroll pane, and by GridPane set viewport view, I'm setting that the GridPane is a view for the grid table information. So I have that MVC relationship inside my actual view section as well. So my view has its own MVC going along with it. And so it has some default code behind the scenes so that my GridPane can handle the built-in structure of the control handling of dealing with that actual view. So that gives me some stuff already right there. Now, because I did this setupTable method, the only thing that I'm going to be putting inside my panel of these two will merely be that lovely GridPane. I don't add the grid table because it's added already vis-a-vis this GridPane set viewport view, so it's inside it already. So we take a look at my setupPanel method. My setupPanel is where I've been all year. We've been just putting all the stuff that go inside our components. I have a set size on there, so I can override the size if it's not the right size on that. I'm not using that for this today. My set layout assigns my spring layout as my manager for that. And then I add that GridPane, my associated fields and columns that I'll be using to actually go over that. And again, notice that I do not add the grid table anywhere in here. So I click on that so it's highlighted. We can see that it's clearly not being added there because it's already been added vis-a-vis the GridPane right here. The order of this doesn't matter because when I'm adding them into the spring layout, it just simply puts them all in the top left corner and then I can arrange them as needed. I have this lovely collapse method right here from lines 83 to 106, my setup layout method. That's just where I use the base layout.putConstraint information where it adds all the constraints from using the spring layout that we use inside this lovely design window. We'll take a look at what happens because of that. What I really want to show off right here in the code section is the idea that we have our setupListeners method, and our only button right here in this case, the submit button, has a action listener that's been added to it, and I call baseController.updateQuery, passing it just the text. And I just grab the text from the fields that are user generated. I don't do any validation or anything inside the GUI because I'll handle that inside the actual controller itself because the controller is the one that's responsible for making decisions. After that update query method has been called, I then call repaint to make any changes to the GUI based on any data changes that happen because I've used this lovely MVC relationship right here in that default table model, that amazing tool right there that says, oh, I've got a model with a view and a controller already specified, and so that data model right here of getGrid is linking the model to the view right here of that lovely GridPane set viewport view. So I've had that model view relationship already, and the controller then has the relationship to talk to it. And so I don't have to do any special links to that other than call the repaint method of the GUI. And the repaint is what GUI knows how to do. It's great at painting that. So let's go ahead and let's take a quick look at the design, see how that's set up. As you can see, I got my lovely little curry label right here, just using it to hold an image of curry. I have my amazing button to change the spice level. I have a row and column label and associated input field, as well as the input field that I can type in the spice level. If you click on any one of these components, you can see right here where they have the constraints that are attached to that. The information that's generated from the setup, the lovely base controller adjustments right here that are against the constraints on the west, east, north, south, etc. for the different components. Not a lot of helpful information other than doing GUI design, so I just put it inside that one method to hide it out of the way since it's not relevant to what we're actually doing from the code side and the design side of the software. So we have our quick little design right there. We're going to go back over to our source right here, and we're going to run this program. Hey, look, it's my to creation. That lovely start method centers it so it's the pop-up window here is attached to the actual application itself. Click OK to dispose of it since we don't need to keep track of it. And we have right here the icon. I have the fact that I've got input fields right here, here, and here. And my setup, my lovely fill method right here drags and puts everything inside that. So I have all the initialized values inside that. Because I have that default value of -99 for everything on there, that immediately has the information that gets attached to it. And so what I can do is I can go and specify any valid row or column in here. So I type in, say, for example, 0, 0. And instead of -99, we're going to change this one right here to be 23. I click on change the splice level, and as you can see in the 0, 0 location, that value immediately changed to 23 because we have the information, so it automatically links to that. So let's go take a look at how that happens. So what we do, back inside the controller right here, we have inside the panel, it calls that lovely controller method, update curry. So we go to our grid controller class. Inside grid controller, we have our update curry method. As you can see with the Java doc documentation right here, it takes those string information for the row, the column, and the value. And then I use an isValid method. The isValid method makes sure that the string input is a valid value that can be parsed as an integer. And if it is possible, then I then change the associated grid at this row and that column to assign the spice level of that specific thing. And the isValid method, all it does is it takes that single string parameter right here, make sure that is a parsable value. If it is parsable, it returns true. Otherwise, it catches that number format exception. That number format exception, we don't use it. We just give a pop-up message saying that it's going to say use int silly and return false. So if I type in an incorrect value, it's not going to have any problem. It's just going to give a little thing saying you need to use the right number and allow me to continue from there. Looking again at the update curry method, this is the method that we have inside our controller class. We have this method because we want to have the idea of a model view controller separation. So the idea that we can have the view, all it's responsible for is handling the information from the GUI from the user itself. And so what we do is we use this lovely update curry method. It takes just the string inputs that come directly from the user out of the input fields because they only provide strings for us in Java. And then I pass them to my isValid method. My isValid method, again, is a verification method. It's a private method. It's a helper method. It's only visible, again, inside the controller. And we use that to make sure that we can only make sure that we get a valid numeric input. So it's just making sure that we can actually specify these are correct number values. Now, as you see right here, I'm only calling isValid on the row, the column, and the value itself. I don't check to make sure they're within range. That would be the responsibility of another separate method, one that you could possibly do to make this a more robust program. But again, that's something that goes beyond simply the introduction of what we're doing with this project. And within the isValid method, we just make sure the integer.parseInt, if that line executes properly, we don't even store the actual integer in there. If that line executes, we'll return true. If that line, however, throws an exception, it'll throw a number format exception. That number format exception is going to then say, oh, crap, I can't handle this. It's like dividing by 0. We can't do this. And so we'll have a pop-up message that's centered on the actual frame and a reminder to the user that they need to use integers, and then returns false. So this way, we don't crash our system. We merely have the idea of going on and having that happen. So if we go back to the actual program itself, and if I type in an invalid value, in the case right here of 5, and I type a regular number and also another regular number right here, so we have a invalid value, a valid value, and because of the fact that I'm using it on this sequence, a compound and test, so this is true, and that is true, and that is true. All three values have to be true for this to execute properly. So we go back over there, I change the spice level and it says use int silly, and at that point, I just come right back to my program. It hasn't shut down, nothing's crashed on that. So I go ahead and change that then instead to say, for example, 5, row 5, and change the spice level, and we can see that we have changed the spice level on that one to 2. So we have the ability to actually change that information, matching it directly from that. So that's what we've got right there. We're going to go ahead and take a look at one more thing inside the controller so we can see what happens if we do something a little bit wrong. So let's go ahead and go back to the controller file. Now, if we look at the constructor of the controller right here, I have that note to say create the model objects here before the GUI. It's a very important thing we need to do. And so this is because we want to actually see what happens when we actually use this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually move this line right here, line 18, where I create the frame. And I'm going to move that line up first before I even create my grid. So I'm going to do my view first instead of my model. And so all my data members are still initialized, just like I should normally do within any constructor object. But what we're going to see happen is when I run this program with this version instead, where I create the GUI first and then create the reference, we're going to see something different happen. So let's go ahead and hit play. And as you can see now, there is nothing inside my system. I have nothing I can do. There's nothing in here. It's completely empty. Now if I can go up here and I go to row 2 and column 3, and I give that value of 55, and I change the spice level, there's nothing there. There's no reference to it. Because of the fact that I haven't actually initialized this before I start, this is set up so it's not going to do us any good. And so if you see something like this happening where you have the fact that your GUI is running, it's all right there, there's no crash, there's nothing happening, but nothing's actually responsive to it, it's most likely because of the fact that you've gone in your code, and instead of initializing your model first like we should, we've instead initialized our view first. So it's very important we actually set that up so we can actually initialize our model before we initialize our view. So let's go ahead and move that back to where it belongs. Again, noting our lovely reference right here. And we'll play that again just to verify, show that it works. And look, we're back to a regular version with this where you can see the spice level of all of our objects. I can go and I can type in 2, 3, and give it a value, some nice ridiculous spice level. And as you can see right here, 76.54. We've got this huge ultra spicy curry. Fantastic stuff to eat. So again, looking at our project really fast, we've gone through, and if we take a look at the framework for the class, we have inside our lovely source folder, I have a copy of my zip. Inside my source folder, we have the zip of all the tests. You can practice, make sure your code is properly done. We have in our controller, we have our controller and our runner. Runner's pretty standard, don't even need to show that. We've already seen the model. We have inside our test, we have a bunch of tests that we're going to run. We're going to take a look at that next. And then I have inside my grid view, I have my grid view package. Inside the view package, I also have an image where I have my curry picture, so we can have that running. Now we're using JUnit test to have this happen. Now again with unit tests, it's the idea that we're actually making sure the code itself works properly, so that not only do we have a functional code as it actually compiles and runs, but it actually runs the way we want it to. And so we go take a look at the different tests that go along with this. The grid test plural, this one just is the test suite which executes all the tests for it. Then we have the panel test, the frame test, and the controller test. I did not write a test for the model because the model is simply just a collection of getters and setters. It's really simple this time, so it doesn't need anything on that. But let's go look at the controller test file. As you can see right here, we have a private data member of a grid controller called test controller. And in the setup and teardown methods, I either initialize that grid controller or I set it to be null so it can recreate that happening every time. We then have a series of tests that go along with this. I have a test grid controller making sure that I actually have a grid that returns something. I make sure that I have a number of rows and columns so I can actually match what I'm looking for inside the class. Then I also have the fact that I have a frame that exists as part of it, so I'm making sure that frame is not null. And then finally, that my GUI frame is not the correct type. So I'm using the instance of keyword, and where I'm using the class required naming convention of GridFrame for that value. On my grid model test, I'm going to use a for loop to iterate over the entire structure. And as you can see right here, I'm asserting that inside the row of all the grid's length and sub0.length that we have an actual value existing within it. So I'm making sure that everything's initialized. It's not just a default initialized array. I've actually gone through and filled the array. I also make sure that my toString method has been properly used. In this case, making sure there's not an @ sign. And so I use the test control get grid contains @. So I want to make sure that's false because I do not want to see the @ sign inside that because that means I use the default toString. And finally, my toString method is not long enough. And so I have on that one, I want to make sure that I have the toString.length, making sure it's at least 5 characters long. And that's because of the fact I wanted to actually make sure toString was actually demonstrating, what we're actually covering in class. We look finally over at our test panel and test frame. Frame test creates a frame, passes it a new grid controller because I just need to make sure it actually has that connection. I make sure that the data controller gets initialized, that it is a grid controller, and that I have a content pane. And finally, in my setup frame, I make sure that I have a title on there, using the trim to make sure I get rid of any empty blank spaces that are at the front or the end. And finally, making sure that the content panel is the right type and using the idea of GridPanel for that, and making sure the minimum size requirements are also met. And our final test, the test panel, or panel test, I go through and make sure that my data members are initialized for that. I have a test setup panel, making sure I have at least 9 components inside my system so I can actually add some features to my device. I also assert that my layout panel, or my layout for the panel, is at least either Spring layout or that my test panel's layout is null, because you can use an absolute layout, but I don't prefer it. I then use a for loop to iterate over all of the components that are inside that thing, making sure that if it is a JScrollPane, I'm going to have my pane count go up, and then making sure if that JScrollPane exists, that its view is actually a JTable. My table count variable will also go up, and also making sure that my text fields, that all of them are editable, making sure that each one of them is set to editable, because we've made a few that are not editable, and I want to make sure that's available for us right away. We then have the idea of our assert true, making sure that we're using that count, so that count variable greater than 0, making sure my JScrollPane is available, and also making sure my table count is greater than 0, making sure my scroll pane has been inside it. Making sure that I've inserted my JTable into my scroll pane. Then I have my test setup listeners. I go through, iterate over every button, making sure each button has an action listener and it's been instantiated. So this is where we're going for that, making sure we actually can test those values. So again, just a quick review of the class itself. We're using the idea to look at a 2D grid. We use the idea right here, making a 2D grid of a custom model object, in this case a curry. I create that custom grid. I use my helper method fill grid where I iterate over this 2D grid of information of this 2D array. I initialize each value to be a new object. I then have a reference so I can have a start method, get grid so I can have that, as well as get frame for testing purposes. I have my helper method so I can update the information using the model view controller message passing. So I pass the information from the GUI to the controller then makes sure it's appropriate values, and then correctly updates the model vis-a-vis this lovely 2D array. We also finally have our 2D, we also have our helper method, making sure that we're properly using the data types. In this case, making sure that my string temp is parsable as an int. So that's where we're going with this 2D project. Thanks, and have a great day.